Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective. We have a real problem in the White House. So I believe that he will attack Iran sometime prior to the election because he thinks that's the only way he can get elected. Isn't it pathetic?
Up and fight.
It was very great to find inspiration here because we see a lot of good things happening in Central Eastern Europe. We can learn a lot from that in the West.
It's complicated. You are rich anyway. Belgium is a rich country. Economy is working, but the basis of
Soccer
the society,
But we have,
even better than it was.
I'm afraid that the worst thing in the West is that we have lost family values. Like the women and the families are not having children anymore because they don't see a future. They only think about themselves. And we are trying to change that too.
What I regularly got as opinion from Belgium and from other countries saying that we can't change, it's impossible. Simply don't believe it. It's democracy.
Yes.
It depends on what you want. If you would like to change, change it. Stand up and fight.
The first step is believing that you can change it.
Greetings, citizens of the world, we are anonymous. This is a message from the collective. 160 million people died in wars during the 20th century. In this 21st century, 80 million people have been killed by war and violence. 50 million people were injured. 90% of them were innocent civilians, most were women and children. 40 million children are psychologically damaged from the trauma. These are all facts. People chose to remain blind to what is happening around them in the world, especially when it goes against what they have made to believe, instead of confronting the problem and demanding a change. Do not forget that your own government and corporations have created this mass genocide. They are also responsible for destroying our Earth. Are we really going to continue to tolerate this? What are we going to do now? Sit in your seat and keep complaining what is right and what is not, and nothing changes. People are complaining about someone saying a bad word to them, when there are people dying every second. Get over the games and bullshit. We all know what is important. Then start acting like it. If we want a better future for our children, then we must resist now. If I say now, it is now.
I realized that we had probably pulled the wool over the American people's eyes, and certainly over the international community's eyes, and so I felt pretty low about it. I wish I had resigned. One of the things that disturbs me most about this is that the same tactics are being used as were used in 2002 and early 2003 with regard to Iraq. The same people, the same tactics, the same litany, the same strategy, the same everything. And yet there seems to be, as Gore Vidal called the American people, we are the United States of amnesia. There seems to be no reasonable attitude out there about this, that, hey, we've seen this before. We do not need to do this again. We've been at war for 17 years now, but that's the problem we have in this country. No one remembers these things, no one associates them with the present or the future, and we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again.
Fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
This decision in 2003 to invade Iraq will be ever interpreted by historians as a catastrophic strategic mistake. What we did when we invaded Iraq was violate 40 plus years of U.S. foreign and security policy. We destroyed the balance of power in the Persian Gulf. And we started what is going on now and probably will be going on for years to come, this massive chaos, killing, death, starvation, states failing and so forth, Syria, Libya, Iraq, and possibly Lebanon, maybe Jordan. What we have is chaos, and we produce that chaos. Just as sure as we produced the chaos, we produced ISIS. We produced all of this by that really unwise decision in 2003 to invade Iraq. The campaign to convince the American people to support the war in Iraq, which was quite effective. And when you consider it was built on a house of lies, it was quite effective. Iran is not this kind of threat that we're saying she is. They don't even have nuclear weapons. Israel is sitting on top of 200 or 300 nuclear weapons. It may deny it all day long, but it's got nuclear weapons. So Iran does not have nuclear weapons. And in my consideration, it stopped trying to build nuclear weapons early in the 2000s. I think there's a real problem in this country right now with the fact that we've been at war for 17 years. Less than 1% of the country is bleeding and dying for the other 99%. Those young men and women come from the less affluent and the less educated. They come from the poor. That's who's fighting your wars for you right now. And maybe many people out there who will say, thank you for your service, but what you're really doing is assuaging your own guilt, because that's what we've been doing for 17 years. We need to stop doing this. As a young man, 21 years old, I went to war in Vietnam. I went to a war that was built on lies. As an older man, I was Chief of Staff at the State Department and watched another war unfold, built on lies, the war with Iraq. Now we are getting ready to go to war with another country, Iran, on another house of lies. We need to prevent that.
Triggered the First and Second World Wars that left 70 million killed and hundreds of millions injured or homeless, who created the wars in the Korean Peninsula and in Vietnam, who imposed through deceit and hypocrisy the Zionists and over 60 years of war, homelessness, terror, and mass murder on the Palestinian people and on the countries of the region, who imposed and supported for decades military dictatorships and totalitarian regimes on Asian, African, and Latin American nations, and established friendly relations with all of them, who used atomic bombs against defenseless people and stockpiled thousands of warheads in their arsenals, whose economies rely on waging wars and selling arms, who provoked and encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade and impose an 8-year war on Iran, and who assisted and equipped him to deploy chemical weapons against our cities and our people, who used the mysterious September 11th incident as a pretext to attack Afghanistan and Iraq, killing, injuring, and displacing millions in two countries with the ultimate goal of bringing into its domination the Middle East and its oil resources, who undermined the Bretton Woods system and printed trillions of dollars without the backing of gold reserves or equivalent currency, a move that triggered inflation worldwide and was intended to prey on the economic gains of other nations. What country's military spending exceeds annually $1,000 billion, more than the military budgets of all countries of the world combined? Which governments are the most indebted ones in the world, and who is the government that threatens all nations and countries with any excuse?
I have great pleasure in welcoming the Prime Minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Public Affairs and the Diaspora, His Excellency Benjamin Netanyahu of the State of Israel, and I invite him to address the General Assembly. Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I feel deeply honored and privileged to stand here before you today representing the citizens of the State of Israel. We are an ancient people. We date back nearly 4,000 years to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have journeyed through time. We've overcome the greatest of adversities. And we reestablished our sovereign state in our ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. Now, the Jewish people's odyssey through time has taught us two things. Never give up hope, always remain vigilant. Hope charts the future. Vigilance protects it. Today, our hope for the future is challenged by a nuclear-armed Iran that seeks our destruction. But I want you to know that wasn't always the case. Some 2,500 years ago, the great Persian king Cyrus ended the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people. He issued a famous edict in which he proclaimed the right of the Jews to return to the land of Israel and rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. See, it's not that it's hard to find evidence that Iran has a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program. It's hard to find evidence that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. Yet Iran faces one big problem. And that problem can be summed up in one word: sanctions. I've argued for many years, including on this podium, that the only way to peacefully prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons is to combine tough sanctions with a credible military threat. Ladies and gentlemen, one cold day in the late 19th century, my grandfather, Nathan, and his younger brother, Judah, were standing in a railway station in the heart of Europe. They were seen by a group of anti-Semitic hoodlums who ran towards them, waving clubs, screaming, "Death to the Jews." My grandfather shouted to his younger brother to flee and save himself. And he then stood alone against the raging mob to slow it down. They beat him senseless. They left him for dead. And before he passed out, covered in his own blood, he said to himself, "What a disgrace. What a disgrace. The descendants of the Maccabees lie in the mud, powerless to defend themselves." He promised himself then that if he lived, he would take his family to the Jewish homeland and help build a future for the Jewish people. I stand here today as Israel's Prime Minister because my grandfather kept that promise. In our time, the biblical prophecies are being realized. As the prophet Amos said, "They shall rebuild ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine. They shall till gardens and eat their fruit. And I will plant them upon their soil, never to be uprooted again. Veshavti et shvut ami Yisrael, uvanu arim neshamot vayashavu, venatu kramim veshatu et yainam, ועשו גינות ואכלו את פריים, ונטטים על אדמתם, ולא ינטשו עוד. Ladies and gentlemen, the people of Israel have come home never to be uprooted again.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ambassadors, and world leaders, 7 decades of history have passed through this hall in all of their richness and drama. Where I stand, the world has heard from presidents and premiers at the height of the Cold War. We have seen the foundation of nations. We have seen the ringleaders of revolution. We have beheld saints who inspired us with hope, rebels who stirred us with passion, and heroes who emboldened us with courage. All here to share plans, proposals, visions, and ideas on the world's biggest stage. Like those who met us before, our time is one of great contests, high stakes, and clear choices. The essential divide that runs all around the world and throughout history is once again thrown into stark relief. It is the divide between those whose thirst for control deludes them into thinking they are destined to rule over others, and those people and nations who want only to rule themselves. I have the immense privilege of addressing you today as the elected leader of a nation that prizes liberty, independence, and self-government above all. The United States, after having spent over $2.5 trillion since my election to completely rebuild our great military, is also by far the world's most powerful nation. Hopefully, it will never have to use this power. Americans know that in a world where others seek conquest and domination, our nation must be strong in wealth, in might, and in spirit. That is why the United States vigorously defends the traditions and customs that have made us who we are. Like my beloved country, each nation represented in this hall has a cherished history, culture, and heritage that is worth defending and celebrating, and which gives us our singular potential and strength. The free world must embrace its national foundations. It must not attempt to erase them or replace them. Looking around and all over this large, magnificent planet, the truth is plain to see. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique. It is why we in the United States have embarked on an exciting program of national renewal. In everything we do, we are focused on empowering the dreams and aspirations of our citizens. Thanks to our pro-growth economic policies, our domestic unemployment rate reached its lowest level in over half a century. Fueled by massive tax cuts and regulations cuts, jobs are being produced at a historic rate. 6 million Americans have been added to the employment rolls in under 3 years. Last month, African American, Hispanic American, and Asian American unemployment reached their lowest rates ever recorded. We are marshaling our nation's vast energy abundance, and the United States is now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. Wages are rising, incomes are soaring, and 2.5 million Americans have been lifted out of poverty in less than 3 years. As we rebuild the unrivaled might of the American military, we are also revitalizing our alliances by making it very clear that all of our partners are expected to pay their fair share of the tremendous defense burden which the United States has borne in the past. The United States does not seek conflict with any other nation. We desire peace, cooperation, and mutual gain with all. But I will never fail to defend America's interests. One of the greatest security threats facing peace-loving nations today is the repressive regime in Iran. Following our withdrawal, we have implemented severe economic sanctions on the country. Hoping to free itself from sanctions, the regime has escalated its violent and unprovoked aggression. In response to Iran's recent attack on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, we just imposed the highest level of sanctions on Iran's central bank and sovereign wealth fund. All nations have a duty to act. No responsible government should subsidize Iran's bloodlust. Today I repeat a message for the world that I have delivered at home. America will never be a socialist country. In the last century, socialism and communism killed 100 million people. Even in free nations, we see alarming signs and new challenges to liberty. A small number of social media platforms are acquiring immense power over what we can see and over what we are allowed to say. A permanent political class is openly disdainful, dismissive, and defiant of the will of the people. Yesterday, I was also pleased to host leaders for a discussion about an ironclad American commitment protecting religious leaders and also protecting religious freedom. This fundamental right is under growing threat around the world. Hard to believe, but 80% of the world's population lives in countries where religious liberty is in significant danger or even completely outlawed. Liberty is only preserved, sovereignty is only secured, democracy is only sustained, greatness is only realized by the will and devotion of patriots. My fellow leaders, the path to peace and progress and freedom and justice and a better world for all humanity begins at home. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the nations of the world. And God bless America. Thank you very much. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. Last week, we took decisive action to stop a ruthless terrorist from threatening American lives. In recent days, he was planning new attacks on American targets, but we stopped him. Iran's hostilities substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013. And they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion in cash. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration. The very defective JCPOA expires shortly anyway and gives Iran a clear and quick path to nuclear breakout. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before. America has achieved energy independence. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration. After destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate.
Technology developed most rapidly out of war. So the Romans, in the conquest of Gaul, had to build a wall to keep a tribe from Switzerland from interfering. And they built this magnificent wall, which can still be seen, running like 40 miles to keep them out. The building of these facilities allowed the building of roads, and that facilitated trade, movement, and so there was an intimate connection between the technological advance of the military
Is a global war coming? Of course. There's never been a century that didn't have a global war. The 20th century you know about, 19th century is the Napoleonic Wars, 18th century was the 7 Years' War. We can go back and back and back and back. But if you don't think there's a global war coming, then you're saying that the 21st century is going to be the first century in which there isn't a global war. And I will bet against you any amount you want. In fact, global war, all war is sitting with you right now. It's sitting in your pocket. I present to you the iPhone. You've seen this. It carries such superb tools on it as YouTube and Tinder and all the essentials. And you guys are so cool that you know that this represents the future and makes you completely different because, well, you're cool.
I studied German philosophy primarily. I studied the Greeks, but it was German philosophy. I mean, there were things that I had to understand. I had to understand the Holocaust, and I couldn't understand it in the simple idea that men went crazy. It was more complex than that. So what was it in German philosophy? But I also wanted to study Marx. And I wrote some of my early works on Karl Marx because he was the enemy. So the Soviet Union was a Marxist state. Hungary was a Marxist state. I had to understand Marxism. And so my first work was on Marx and trying to, who was, by the way, a brilliant man, except that he was wrong about what would happen. But he really understood some of the important things about modern capitalism. When you read Marx carefully, you realize that his idea of internationalism, he doesn't mean. That he understands that, he wrote on the Austrian-Italian War. That was not an important war, but he understood nations. He understood that the Germans were different from the French and so on. And when you read it carefully, you will understand why socialism turns into nationalism. The Soviet Union, in the end, became merely an other nation that said it believed certain things. But from the beginning, when Lenin made his peace with the Germans, and the Germans had taken him to St. Petersburg, it was the nations that mattered, not the ideology. So Stalin in World War II had one interest, saving the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union it was called now. And many of the ideological things that he said he was using primarily to create terror in the country. But I learned that in the end, all the ideologies, all the beliefs of liberalism, everything, in the end, without a nation state that was yours, they meant nothing.
So, something in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the labs there, we moved to Los Alamos, and that would be moved to Brookhaven National Laboratories. And what were they doing in these laboratories? Doing research on nuclear wars, because that was the big story then. It was developed with only one thing in mind: to make research more efficient. And when you get on the internet, all the protocols you get and all the cool stuff that gets you around were developed by American scientists who were deeply involved in the Cold War.
The United States entered into a confrontation with the Soviet Union in the late 1940s. And the Americans and the Russians constantly thought about war with each other. There are various ways of thinking about war, but one of the ways was the idea of designing what the Germans called Kriegsspiel, war games. And what happened was that when I was young, in 1972, computers became available.
You think about war as something that doesn't really have to do with you. And then you pick up this phone, and every bit of it is drenched in war, in fear of war, and everything else. Now, the Americans are peculiar. In the United States government, they're not allowed to have patents. Basic rule is, if the US government invented it, and it's not secret, it's yours for the taking. It's an odd rule, but it works for us. It means that everything we do in preparing for wars, designing aircraft, everything else, ultimately comes down to being available.
On the one hand, you have this enormous power of the United States. On the other hand, a complete unpredictability, because there is no operating principle. We're too young. This is not different from the Roman Empire in the early days. This is no different from the British Empire. I mean, the British were defeated by a third world country, the United States, in a war, crushed in a war. They survived. They recovered. We are in that position. The Poles, the Romanians. Now, you have problems with the Romanians, I understand. I'm also not interested. I'm interested, from my country's point of view, in the political, military, economic bloc that exists here. So I will predict that for Europe, at least, in this century, Eastern Europe will become what Central Europe was in the 19th century.
Russia is in decline. Germany exports 50% of its GDP. Half of its economy depends on its customers buying. And right now, its biggest customer is the United States. And we have a crazy president who doesn't like Merkel, and he's capable of anything. When you're as big as the United States, you can make stupid moves and get away with it. With all of this rising and falling, you think there won't be war? Well, the world is filled with war right now.
In every generation, young people have plans for their lives. In just about every generation, their planning events change the lives they expect to have. And that one of the most common things that does that is war. And that war has not been abolished. It is not something that happens far away. It will occur. And so the expectations of what your life will be like and what it is different. So I'm sure that our parents, grandparents, so on in the 1930s never expected their lives to be what it was. When we look at history, the gap between what will be and what people think it will be is enormous.
But he didn't get to go. The warning that I have to you is that war lurks in your life everywhere. The output of the war. And you can pretend this is an innocent, harmless tool, but every piece of it was designed to kill or to help killing. It's just true. It also means that you're going to have to face the fact that the odds are, since it's been 70 years since the last systemic war, that's not going to be another 70 years before the next one.
When you feel safe, this is the most dangerous period. Always be mature, always be careful, always enter into relationships that benefit you, and not because the Messiah is going to come and solve all your problems.
Is white supremacy not a global issue? We've seen white supremacist attacks that were clearly domestic terrorism. Experts, in fact, the acting AG, Jeff Sessions, even called some of these incidents domestic terrorism incidents. The Emmanuel AME Church shooting of Black Americans in Charleston and the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh of Jewish people, those were only designated and charged as hate crimes, not domestic terrorist incidents.
You're not going to find an actual charge of domestic terrorism out there. If you look at Title 18, right, If you're looking for...
Well, it says here that, but at the San Bernardino shooting or the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, they were designated and charged as domestic terrorist incidents.
They were charged, I'd have to go back and look, they were charged likely with, if there was a connection to a foreign terrorist organization, it would likely fall under 18 U.S.C. 23 A or B.
So because the perpetrator was Muslim, they are... Doesn't it seem that because the perpetrator is Muslim,
that's not correct. That has nothing
that
to do,
the designation would say it's a foreign organization?
That's not correct. That is not correct.
Okay. Can you explain why?
So, homegrown violent extremists, most of the people we arrest in the United States, homegrown violent extremists, self-radicalized, born in the U.S., doesn't matter what religion.
But the Orlando Pulse Club shooter meets those qualifications, and you're implying...
He was worked as an international terrorist because he was following under the definition...
But he was homegrown and self-radicalized.
Extremist cases, how we work homegrown violent extremist cases, under the global jihad, we worked under international terrorism. That is correct.
Is white supremacy not a global issue?
It is a global issue.
So why are they not charged with foreign
Because the United
terrorism?
States Congress doesn't have a statute for us for domestic terrorism like we do on a foreign terrorist organization like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab.
Could you see how this could create issues and discrepancies with how violent extremism by Muslim perpetrators could potentially, even if it's unintentional, but that there are holes and there are gaps here, not through your fault or any one specific person's fault. It could be our fault as Congress. But could you see how one could see how the way that we are pursuing and charging white supremacy, particularly if they tend to be charged with hate crimes and where that same type of violence committed by a Muslim extremist could be charged with domestic terrorism. Hate crimes and domestic terrorism are treated and charged, they're different crimes, and they could be pursued differently with different resource allocations. Can you see how people would say that these are being treated differently?
So you won't take down lies, or you will take down lies? I think it's just a pretty simple yes or no.
Congresswoman,
You announced recently that the official policy of Facebook now allows politicians to pay to spread disinformation in 2020 elections and in the future. So I just want to know how far I can push this in the next year. Under your policy, using census data as well, could I pay to target predominantly black zip codes and advertise them the incorrect election date?
no, Congresswoman, you couldn't. We have, even for these policies around the newsworthiness of content that politicians say, and the general principle that I believe that...
But you said you're not going to fact check my ads.
We have, if anyone, including a politician, is saying things that can cause, that is calling for violence, or could risk imminent physical harm, or voter or census suppression when we roll out the census suppression policy, we will take that content down.
So you will, there is some threshold where you will fact check political advertisements. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, Congresswoman, yes, for specific things like that, where there's imminent risk of harm.
Could I run ads targeting Republicans in primaries saying that they voted for the Green New Deal?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Would I be able to run advertisements on Facebook targeting Republicans in primaries saying that they voted for the Green New Deal? I mean, if you're not fact-checking political advertisements, I'm just trying to understand the bounds here. What's fair game?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I think
so. You don't know if I'll be able to do that.
I think probably.
Do you see a potential problem here with a complete lack of fact-checking on political advertisements?
Well, Congresswoman, I think lying is bad, and I think if you were to run an ad that had a lie, that would be bad. That's different from it being, in our position, the right thing to do to prevent your constituents or people in an election from seeing that you had lied.
So you won't take down lies, or you will take down lies? I think it's just a pretty simple yes or no.
Congresswoman,
I'm not talking about spin. I'm talking about actual
yes, in most cases, in a democracy, okay. I believe that people should be able to see for themselves
what politicians that they may or may not vote for
So
are
you
saying,
won't take
judge
them
their
down.
character for themselves.
So you won't take, you may flag that it's wrong, but you won't take it down.
Congresswoman, it depends on the context that it shows up. Organic post, ads, the treatment is a little
One more question. In your ongoing dinner parties with far-right figures, some of who advance the conspiracy theory that white supremacy is a hoax, did you discuss so-called social media bias against conservatives, and do you believe there is a bias?
Congresswoman, so I don't remember everything that was in the question.
That's all right, I'll move on. Can you explain why you've named the Daily Caller, a publication well-documented with ties to white supremacists, as an official fact-checker for Facebook?
Congresswoman, sure. We actually don't appoint the independent fact-checkers. They go through an independent organization called the Independent Fact-Checking Network that has a rigorous standard for who they allow to serve as a fact-checker.
So you would say that white supremacist-tied publications meet a rigorous standard for fact-checking? Thank you.
Congresswoman, I would say that we're not the one assessing that standard. The International Fact-Checking Network is the one who is setting that standard.
This is a pattern about some people being subject to the rule of law and others not. I think that this taps into a deeper narrative and a deeper pattern of what is happening out of this administration, where they believe that the rule of law only belongs and applies to some people and not others. Right here and now, we're about 20 years away from the Central Park 5, where the president put out a full-page ad demanding the death penalty for 5 black and brown boys. Boys, they were not yet 18 years old, demanding the death penalty for something they were accused of and innocent of. And here we have just documented evidence of multiple times a violation of the same law, and he won't even issue a slap on the wrist.
Let me know when the jail sentence starts.
This is a pattern about some people being subject to the rule of law and others not. And when that happens, there is no rule of law at all. At all. And that's why it's important that we make sure that everyone is held accountable, because whether it's a billionaire, whether it's an administration official, or whether it's a postal worker or a kid on the street, we all must be held accountable to the same extent by the rule of law. Thank you very much. I have student loans too. And I think it's so funny. A year ago, I was waiting tables in a restaurant, and it was literally easier for me to become the youngest woman in American history elected to Congress than it is to pay off my student loan debt. So that should tell you everything about the state of our economy and the state of quality of life for working people. Because in order for me to get a chance to have health care, in order for me to get a chance to pay off my student loans, I had to do something that was nearly impossible. And I don't think that that is the bar through which a person should be able to access education, health care, and a bevy of other things that should be considered human rights. And this bill, and I'm so excited to be introducing this bill with Senator Sanders, Congresswoman Omar, and Congresswoman Jayapal, to make sure that we start embarking on the solutions to these problems.
Cet amendement vise à supprimer le subside qu'on appelle le subside de frais de fonctionnement aux groupes politiques. Ça va réaliser une économie de pratiquement 10 millions d'euros.
On vote d'abord sur l'amendement de M. Van Hees. Begin van de stemming. Het amendement is verworpen.
Er wordt gezegd dat iedereen moet besparen, maar blijkbaar is er één groep die vooralsnog niet moet besparen. En dat zijn de parlementsleden zelf, die meer dan €6.000 per maand verdienen, netto.
En het mag niet holder de bolder gaan, want het is moeilijk en technisch. Maar het is nooit moeilijk en technisch wanneer het gaat over besparingen op sociaal werk, cultuur of middenveld. Het is alleen moeilijk en technisch dat het gaat over de eigen lonen.
Collega's, wie is er voor de spoedbehandeling van de 2 voorstellen van collega Dazen? De spoed is bij deze verworpen.
Donc le premier élément qui pose question, c'est effectivement que le débat sur ce document a eu lieu à huis clos. Donc pour nous, ça pose évidemment un problème de transparence de base. Et le second élément, c'est évidemment ce document contient notamment les rémunérations auxquelles les députés et les ministres ont droit. Vous connaissez la position de notre parti par rapport à ça. On pense que ça doit sérieusement diminuer, que c'est un enjeu non seulement personnel, mais aussi un enjeu collectif pour rapprocher le niveau socio-économique de vie des députés et des ministres du niveau socio-économique de nos citoyens. Vous ne pas sans savoir qu'en tant que député, on fait partie des 10% des personnes les mieux payées en Belgique, en tant que ministre même des 1% des personnes les mieux payées en Belgique, et donc ça on pense que ça doit changer.
In the 1950s, a weapon was invented that has become more powerful than America's deadliest weapons of mass destruction. It is the weapon of mass deception, and it is right in our own living rooms. The hypnotizing world of picture television brings us the news of the world through 2 central news agencies called Reuters and the Associated Press. The Rothschilds bought Reuters in the 1800s, which later bought the Associated Press and made the Rothschild family owners of the world's largest central news services. British East India Shipping Company and profited handsomely, not just from drug trafficking, but from trafficking African slaves with her slave trader, John Hawkins. First, knighted her slave trader with the noble title of Sir John Hawkins. By 1830, the British had distanced themselves from dope dealing by granting opium monopoly rights to the Jewish Sassoon family, who became known as the Rothschilds of the Far East. As an agent for the Crown, David Sassoon shared his dope profits with Queen Victoria.
The British East India Company built a major factory to process the opium here at Gazipur. It's still a lucrative earner for the Indian government, which sells opiates to the world's pharmaceutical industry.
When the Chinese banned opium and destroyed 600 chest loads of the addictive drug, Sassoon and the British retaliated.
It was a financial disaster for the British. With huge profits at stake, they retaliated with the Opium Wars of 1843 and 1858. The forces of the market were to defeat China's moral prohibition.
Sassoon and the British forced drug addiction onto an entire nation, stole the island of Hong Kong, and made Hong Kong the capital of the British international drug trade. Exclusive members were financed into political power positions in the CIA, the U.S. Supreme Court, and the White House. When Skull and Bonesman George Bush Sr. became CIA director in the 1980s, the CIA recruited Osama bin Laden to train Al-Qaeda and Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. The job of Osama's trainees was not just to fight the Russian communists, it was to run Afghanistan's multi-billion-dollar opium trade. Heroin, manufactured from Afghan opium, supplied $250 to $300 billion annually to Wall Street and the U.S. banks. Authors Alfred McCoy and Michael Levine tied the CIA to this unholy drug alliance and received national attention when the CIA tried to suppress their books.
Michael Levine became a best-selling author when he wrote about his experience of this unholy alliance. After 30 years' distinguished service with the DEA, he could write with some authority.
You could look at what they did to me as an example in microcosm of Central Intelligence's actions and the State Department in completely subverting the drug war. You know, the drug war was something that only existed in the minds of Americans, on the streets of America, for kids like my brother, for cops who died. There was no drug war. The biggest drug dealers in the world were given a license to sell drugs to Americans to support themselves. And this continued right down from Southeast Asia, through the Mujahideen, through the Contras.
But how was the heroin smuggled into the United States? One of America's most gruesome secrets is that during the Vietnam War, heroin was smuggled into the United States by hiding it inside the body bags of dead American soldiers. By the end of the 1960s, 1/3 of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam and close to 1 million United States citizens were hooked on heroin. Drugs like LSD, mescaline, marijuana, and hashish also swamped the streets and college campuses of America. Who or what turned America's youth onto these illegal drugs? Celebrity anti-war activists like Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, Allen Ginsberg, and Bertrand Russell sold America's youth on acid rock, tripping out, and one world government. Their financing came from the Warburg Banksters and IPS, Institute for Policy Studies. Over 100 million doses of LSD that hit the streets of America were purchased by Timothy Leary and Alan Dulles through S.G. Warburg's Sandoz AB Pharmaceutical Company in Switzerland. Free sample-sized packages of acid were handed out not only on college campuses, but at rock concerts, where musicians persuaded millions of fans to get high. Critics of the drug culture blame parents, teachers, law enforcement, and everybody except the people behind it all, namely the Rothschild-Warburg banksters and their Committee of 300. The war on Iraq wasn't about revenge for 9/11, since not one of the 19 accused terrorists were Iraqi citizens. It wasn't about weapons of mass destruction, which inspectors hadn't found. It wasn't even about Saddam Hussein, who had been financed into power by the U.S. in the first place, and who got his chemical and biological weapons from American companies. No, the U.S. wars against Iraq and against Afghanistan were about mass murder and piracy. They were about big weapons sales, big oil, big pipelines, big drugs, and big rebuilding contracts. They were about colonizing the Middle East and moving 2 giant steps closer to world domination.
Private First Class Lindy England may never have figured these images would beam into the homes of millions of horrified people. Whatever she might have thought at the time, she says she and her comrades had no choice.
So to stand there, give a thumbs up, smile, stand behind all the naked Iraqis in the pyramid, take a picture.
Who told you to do that?
Persons in my higher chain of command.
Why were naked Muslim prisoners positioned on top of each other in the shape of an Egyptian pyramid? The answer can be found in the distant past. In ancient times, Iraq was called Babylon.
The year is 586 BC. The armies of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, descend on Jerusalem with the wrath of an angry God. It is almost 6 centuries before the birth of Christ. The Romans have not yet even dreamed of empire. It is a dark chapter in the history of the Jews, while Babylon's fierce star is rising. The Bible describes the Babylonian attack. Homes are pillaged, King Solomon's temple is set ablaze and utterly destroyed.
This practice of inbreeding over thousands of years has produced a clever but pathological breed of conscienceless, sociopathic families who will stop at nothing to own every ounce of gold, every drop of water, and every blade of grass on planet Earth. The United Nations, which they founded and control, has clearly stated its goals of establishing a new world order, a UN standing army, and a global taxation system. The Queen's husband, Prince Philip, and Evelyn Rothschild have already established an interfaith declaration for the creation of one world religion. What would life be like in this world empire with one world religion, one world army, one world economy, one world court, one world media, one world government, and one world dictator? What the public doesn't know is that Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto and the Russian Constitution have been built into the UN Charter. The right to live will be based on an individual's rating of usefulness to the royal elite. In this planned world without borders or nations, citizens will be disarmed of all weapons, including handguns, and will have no means to protest, fight, resist, or challenge this one world authority who will control them spiritually, economically, and militarily. Every human being will be electronically tattooed and will become helplessly dependent on this one world authority for all of their most basic needs. The masses will eventually be taught to bow down and worship this one world dictator who will rule the entire world from his eternal throne in Israel.
They have waited for him. They believe in him. They expect he will heal the world's ills. Some say he is the Messiah, finally returned. But this man is not a savior. He is the King of Terror who will usher in the end of everything.
Despite all the red flags, many people deny that a problem even exists. It does exist, and the good news is there are solutions. The solutions lie in knowing what the three biggest fears of the world's ruling families are. The first biggest fear is exposure. They have gone to great lengths to cover up their trail of crimes and to win the public's trust through their media monopolies. Without public trust, their ancestral plan for global control is doomed. Their second biggest fear is losing public support. If the public stops cooperating, their plan is guaranteed to fail. Their third biggest nightmare is organized resistance by an informed and fearless public. The ruling families know from past experience that the will of the people can defeat all their military and monetary might. Vietnam is a perfect example. There is no doubt whatsoever that these ruling families can be totally defeated by turning their three worst fears into a reality.
Yesterday, I was also pleased to host leaders for a discussion about an ironclad American commitment protecting religious leaders and also protecting religious freedom. This fundamental right is under growing threat around the world. Hard to believe, but 80% of the world's population lives in countries where religious liberty is in significant danger.
So somebody had to do it. I am the chosen one.
A lot of people are blaming Corbyn for the result of this election. A lot of people blamed Hillary Clinton for the result of the presidential election that brought Donald Trump in. Now, Clinton and Corbyn are opposites as far as progressive politics are concerned. People have blamed the opposition in India for the re-election of Narendra Modi. They've blamed the opposition in Australia for the election of Scott Morrison, in Brazil for Jair Bolsonaro, similarly in Hungary and Turkey and Poland and the Philippines. Actually, blaming isn't going to get us very far at all, because what we're witnessing is a global phenomenon. Something big has changed. The oligarchs have discovered the formula for persuading the poor to vote for the interests of the very rich. And that formula includes massive lying and cheating on an unprecedented scale, mobilizing social media particularly to generate mendacious, manipulative adverts and memes and conspiracy theories in order to swing people round or to turn them off from voting altogether, pushing forward killer clowns like Johnson, like Trump, like Modi, like Bolsonaro, who will do whatever the oligarchs want, but present a sort of almost amusing face to the public, and so we laugh along with them. And then they learn from each other, they teach each other. In fact, very often the same political operatives will hop from one campaign to another, constantly refining the model, refining the formula. So it's a mistake to fixate on one leader or one political party and say, oh, look how badly they failed. Sure, there are failures. There was a lot of internal division within the Labour Party. That really didn't help. There was a lot of disarray over Brexit, with a lot of wobbling about what the Brexit position should be. Lots of people really liked Labour's manifesto. So it wasn't the policy which was the problem. And I don't even think primarily it was the leadership which was a problem, but any Labour leader putting forward those policies whose aim was to transform this country would have been demonised and ripped apart. The fundamental problem is the incredible grip over our imaginations that the billionaire press still exerts, combined with highly effective and misleading use of social media. This is a global phenomenon. Something huge has changed. People who wouldn't have stood a cat's chance in hell 10 years ago are suddenly winning elections all around the world at the moment. Why is that? Because they have worked out the formula for how to do it. If there is a formula for how to do it, there must also be a formula for how to resist it.
But how? Tell me how!
One of the things we need to do is to ensure that people are much more aware of what is fake and what is real. Dark ads on social media telling total lies. Facebook, Google, Twitter, they're all deeply culpable in this. So we must defend ourselves from lies, and that requires digital literacy, and there are ways of doing that. On the day of our general election, in Finland, a 34-year-old woman, Sanna Marin, was chosen as their Prime Minister, and she's the complete antithesis of Boris Johnson. She could not be more different. There was one crucially important thing that Finland has been doing for the past 5 years, and that's investing very heavily in digital literacy, in helping people understand how they can be manipulated online. Finland has been judged as the country with the highest resistance to fake news now. Now, obviously, we can't expect Johnson or Trump or Modi or Bolsonaro to introduce an effective digital literacy campaign because they don't want their own lies exposed, but you don't have to rely on governments to do that. So the Democratic Party in the US has now produced a guide to confronting online lies, putting massive pressure on the social media platforms, on Google, on Facebook, on Twitter, to just take a completely different attitude to the laissez-faire one that has dominated them so far. What we need to see amongst progressive parties all over the world is a coalition against fake news.
So you would say that white supremacist tied publications meet a rigorous standard for fact-checking?
When you look at the only Labour leader who has succeeded in recent times, Tony Blair, you see someone who has pretty well gone along with the agenda of the billionaire press. I mean, he went to great lengths to butter up Rupert Murdoch, potentially the most dangerous man on earth. The fear, the worry is that he had to do that in order to appease the billionaire press, and that if a Labour leader doesn't do that, they can't succeed. If that is the case, then we have a real big structural institutional problem, and it is called the media. I think there's a pretty horrible atmosphere developing at the moment, a real sort of sense that people want to purge. Got to get rid of all those people who wanted a different country, get rid of all those people who supported Corbyn. But it seems to me that in this renewed, furious public argument between Blairites and Corbynites, or whatever you want to call them, we see people really arguing in the wrong terms about the wrong things and on the wrong scale. They're looking inward, whereas actually they ought to be looking at the political system as a whole and how we can radically change that. The problem we face at the moment, almost regardless of who is in power, is that we have a very top-down 19th century model of politics. What we need to replace that simple linear top-down political model with is what I call political rewilding. A system which is run and owned by the people. We're beginning to see very powerful examples of genuine people-owned grassroots politics developing around the world. And yet this is not reflected in mainstream political theory at all. We don't need to wait for government to do this for us. Government is not going to do this for us. We start doing it at the municipal level, in the towns and the cities. So where there are favourable local authorities, we put pressure on them and we work with them to design these completely new grassroots politics. And then once we demonstrate the model, what you find very rapidly, and this has happened in other parts of the world, other people want it. They see that in their neighbouring town, there's lots of exciting things happening which they don't have in their own town. So the demand for that new politics begins to spread and begins to grow and gradually can transform the nature of the whole nation. And then it's much harder for the oligarchs to get a grip over political life. We also have to attend to the short-term crisis that many people in this country now face.
Even though most of us are really hungry, we have to be careful with our food. So we try not to eat a lot in one day.
Continued austerity, continued exclusion and marginalisation. There's going to be a rising tide of xenophobia and hatred. It's even central government policy now. They're going to attack Romani gypsies and travellers. That's in the manifesto. So the first thing we need to do is to stand in solidarity with everyone who is likely to be victimised by this government. We double down on our efforts to help the people who are being marginalised. We have an overtly racist Prime Minister. Just since the election already, we've seen a marked rise in racist assaults. No one must be left to face the consequences of this election alone. I mean, my big hope is that that result is going to spark a much wider discussion about what needs to change. We need not just a change of government, we need a change of political system. We know that just as there is a formula for the oligarchs to take power, there is a formula for defeating them and for ensuring that there's a far more effective and robust democracy than we've ever witnessed anywhere. And I'm beginning to see the first strands of what that formula might be. And I actually think it's very exciting. So yeah, this is a time of despondency, but it's also a time of hope. Double Down has been achieving extraordinary things, reaching millions of viewers, making the films that you're not going to see anywhere else. And this has been made possible by the fact that it now has over 1,000 patrons. Come and join the network, helping Double Down News to get even bigger and more effective than it is already.
Nazis came to power, they made their first big bust. Watch out, Jews and Gypsies are people you can't trust. Those lesser people have an instinct, a German has a soul. We've suffered enough now, it's time we take control. The next step was Jews at the best positions were fired. And so many unemployed Nazis were hired. And then Jews couldn't have any job at all. The Nazis didn't want their empire to fall. Then all the Jewish-owned houses were confiscated. A future in ghettos and poverty awaited. Then the Nazis took their final step according to plan. The big, massive structural genocide began. Israel. When the Zionists came to power, they made the first big bust. Watch out, Palestinians and Arabs are people you can't trust. Those lesser people have an instinct, a Jew has a soul. We've suffered enough now, it's time we take control. The next step was Palestinians at the best positions were fired, and so many unemployed Zionists were hired. And then Palestinians couldn't have any job at all. The Zionists didn't want their empire to fall. Then all the Palestinian-owned houses were confiscated. A future in ghettos and poverty awaited. Then the Zionists took their final step according to plan. The big, massive structural genocide began.
Mr. Curtis, if you would come forward.
I would ask the court reporter to swear the witness. Mr. Curtis, would you please state your full name for the record?
Name is Clinton Eugene Curtis.
And what is your profession?
I'm a computer programmer.
Mr. Curtis, are there programs that can be used to secretly fix elections?
Yes.
How do you know that to be the case?
Because in October of 2000, I wrote a prototype for President Congressman Tom Feeney at the company I worked for in Oviedo, Florida that did just that.
Hello friends. This is a news update and analysis from Anonymous. As our world faces numerous catastrophes, in the form of famine, economic collapse, genocide, war, and environmental destruction, the people of the world continue to partake in the pageantry of elections, believing that they can somehow fix these problems by putting the right people in charge. Unfortunately, people have been trying this approach for a very long time and things have only continued to get worse. Today we are going to reveal how voting machines can't be trusted. Rigging elections with electronic voting machines is a concept that was popularized by the 2006 documentary Hacking Democracy. In the film, a computer programmer and former NASA employee by the name of Clint Curtis testified under oath in front of the U.S. House Judiciary members in Ohio. Curtis alleged that while working for his former employer Yang Industries, he was asked to help in a scheme to steal votes by inserting fraudulent code into the voting machines. The scheme was allegedly devised as a way to help Republican Congressman Tom Feeney win the election in the year 2000. According to Curtis, he initially agreed to the deal thinking that he was testing the machines to make sure that they couldn't be hacked, but as he began to work on the project, he learned that the team's true intentions were to steal the election.
And did he ever express why he wanted a code to rig an election?
No, I immediately assumed that they were trying to keep you guys from cheating them. So I wrote up the documentation of what you would look for in the source code, how you would make sure that you didn't get, taken advantage of, make sure that All voting machines had receipts because that way you could back count the ones that looked a little funny.
Yang Enterprises denied Curtis's allegations and responded that Curtis was just a disgruntled former employee with a grudge against the company. However, on March 3, 2005, Curtis passed a polygraph test given by Tim Robinson, the retired chief polygraph operator and 20-year veteran of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. When asked if it would have been possible for him to steal the election with some code, he responded by saying that anyone with the skills was capable of doing it.
In 2000, I was working for Yang Enterprises, which was a company in Oviedo, Florida, and their chief lobbyist, their corporate attorney, and Speaker of the House of Florida was Tom Feeney, and he was there to feed his contracts. So he came in one day, one of my first introductions to him, and he wanted us to build a vote flipping software.
He's the Speaker of the Florida House, or about to be.
Right.
He comes into Yang where you're working.
He came in and he wanted a vote fraud system to be built.
Just last year, at DEF CON 26, the world's largest hacking convention, an 11-year-old boy managed to hack a replica of the Florida state election website and change voting results in less than 10 minutes. Organizers of the event said that at least 30 children were able to hack similar replica websites in under a half hour, including an 11-year-old girl who completed the job in just under 15 minutes. One of the attractions of the event was the DEF CON voting machine hacking village, which allowed kids as young as 8 to take a shot at stealing a simulated election. A study at the Argonne National Laboratory in Illinois developed a hack to manipulate voting machines just before the 2012 elections. The researchers who developed the hack were actually able to hijack a Diebold AccuVote TS electronic voting machine, one of the most popular voting systems at the time. Two of the lead researchers in the study were able to demonstrate a number of different ways that voting machines could be hacked. They used a $1.29 microprocessor and a circuit board that costs about $8, along with a $15 remote control. If the average hacker is capable of hacking a voting machine, that means that it must be even easier for politicians and government organizations with infinite resources. The voting machines are only the most obvious aspect of this scam, but it actually goes far deeper, and is woven into the very fabric of our political system. The system was actually designed to keep the power in the hands of the few, despite the fact that most American citizens are taught the opposite in school.
The United States of America, at the order of the President of the United States and the Attorney General, is putting children in cages tonight. That is the country we now live in. Today, Attorney General Jeff Sessions was busy defending the Trump administration's policy that has now been condemned by the United Nations. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said this today about the United States' new practice of separating parents and children at the southern border, including some who have broken no law, who have just presented themselves at the border seeking asylum. The UN said it amounts to arbitrary and unlawful interference in family life and is a serious violation of the rights of the child. Past presidential administrations have, to varying degrees, tried to be international champions of human rights, pressing regimes around the world to improve their records on human rights. But the Trump administration, more than any other in history, simply ignores the subject of human rights. Human rights is not even on the agenda with the world's greatest human rights violator, North Korea. The President of the United States actually intends to have the first ever presidential summit meeting with North Korea's dictator without ever mentioning human rights. And now the United Nations, to America's great shame, has turned its human rights focus to our southern border. And this is what the Attorney General of the United States had to say about it today.
Yes. What's happening is we're having more people coming, bringing children with them, entering between the ports of entry illegally, and they're not, you cannot give them immunity. That's an offense. We believe every person that enters the country illegally like that should be prosecuted, and you can't be given immunity to people who bring children with them recklessly and improperly and illegally. They should never do that.
There is not a new surge of parents and children coming to the southern border. There is no new surge, as the Attorney General is trying to suggest that there is. What is new is this Trump policy. The President of the United States spent his day today tweeting angrily about his Attorney General, not because his Attorney General's lack of sympathy for children at our southern border, but because of the Attorney General's lack of sympathy for the President, the lack of sympathy that allowed Jeff Sessions to recuse himself from the investigation of the President instead of not recusing himself and preventing any investigation of the President. The President saw some children today. He saw them on the south lawn of the White House, where he was trying to get the country to think about football and the national anthem. And even though he himself does not know the words of the national anthem, that is how the President spent his day. The President who has ordered American government workers to rip children from their mothers' and fathers' arms. The President who is literally, according to Senator Jeff Merkley's report, putting those children in cages. The President who is now, according to the United Nations, a human rights violator. We will have more on the President who has decided to put kids in cages next with Maria Teresa Kumar. On the day when the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights said that the United States is violating the human rights of children on the southern border, the Attorney General said this.
It's certainly not our goal to separate children, but I do think it's clear it's legitimate to warn people who come to the country unlawfully, bringing children with them, that they can't expect that they'll always be kept together.
Joining our discussion now, Maria Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino and an MSNBC contributor. And Maria Teresa, the first point that I want to make here, and please feel free to make any point you want, is that this is a new policy. This is not forced on the Trump administration by law. There is no law that has to be changed to change this policy. This is a choice of Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions.
That's exactly right. And this was actually an idea that Chief of Staff Secretary Kelly, when he was Homeland Security Secretary, first floated to do so. The ACLU immediately went into play saying that that was going to be unlawful. And what the UN did today was basically marking what the United States is doing, is violating the rights of children. On May 7th, Jeff Sessions stood before the American people and decided that he was going to separate parents from children because he felt that it was a way to deter people from coming to the border. And what my fellow Americans need to understand are the children and the families that are coming right now on the border. They're not normal immigrants. They're actually refugees. Most of them are fleeing violence. They're fleeing extreme poverty, and that they are traversing 3 to 4 countries to get to the border. And by law, we are supposed to be able to process them when they are seeking asylum. Under this new policy, that is not happening. Instead, what they are saying, the Department of Homeland Security is processing them as criminals and separating their the parents from families under that auspices. But it's actually contrary to precedent. It's contrary to the law.
And Maria Teresa, when the president has tweeted about this, he has, of course, blamed Democrats who have absolutely nothing to do with it. But what you see in that is the president implicitly agreeing that this is a bad policy. That's why he's trying to blame it on the law and blame it on Democrats.
Well, it's completely obfuscating his responsibility. Again, this came directly from his White House. The new policy to separate children from parents at the border is not law. It's not legislation. It was not passed by Congress. It was coming as an equivalent of an executive order coming out of the White House, out of his directive that Jeff Sessions is implementing and that Secretary Nielsen is executing against.
And the idea that the White House has no power to stop this tomorrow.
Nonsense, Lawrence. That's absolutely, that's nonsense. He literally woke up on May 6th and decided on May 7th that he was going to implement this policy. He phoned up Jeff Sessions and basically said, Jeff, you have to implement this. So this is completely out of the discretion of the White House. This has nothing to do with Congress. And if anything, this should be signaling to members of Congress on the Republican and Democratic side that they have to pass some sort of comprehensive immigration reform. Because what is coming out of the White House because of a lack of unified voice on immigration is a de facto immigration policy that is basically not only separating children from parents and putting them into cages as children as young as 2. The ACLU has notified and basically alerted authorities that they have witnessed children as young as 53 weeks, Lawrence, actually facing court and a judge without a parent. Can you imagine that this is happening in modern-day America? And the fact that there's not more outrage? Where is the Republican leadership on this? By allowing the Trump administration to create not only these type of policies, but also converting documented immigrants, such as temporary protected status people, and rescinding DACA, the Trump administration is right now on a journey to create close to 1 million people that are currently undocumented overnight by 2020. So by de facto, he's creating a whole new class of undocumented people. He's also creating a whole class of trauma among children. The United Nations had it absolutely right. This is a violation of children's rights. This is not who we are. We are the ones, if anything, on the global stage, oftentimes telling people what we expect on how you treat minorities, how you treat the most vulnerable among us. This is not leadership.
And Jeff Merkley is the one in the United States Senate who really has shown leadership on this by going down there to the border to try to find out exactly what's going on. We're going to have to leave it there. Maria Teresa Kumar, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lawrence, for covering this.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.